went to China, even before he had went to China, he had always stated very frequently that social change within the Congo is going to come from the rural poor and not necessarily from educated workers, which is something that he really emphasized as his political ideology. Do I have any questions or comments so far?
I'm curious when he was actually like in China and like kind of his why you consider him a Maoist. Like I'm guessing he's like self-described, but like what does it actually look like?
So I believe he went to China sometime between 1962 and 1963. So basically, this was like right after Patrice Lumumba was murdered. Much of his cabinet has fled across the world. Most of them fled to Egypt uh, for safety. But from there, they had contacts with, several revolutionary groups around the world, uh, just offering solidarity and whatnot. And China had a, uh, China, I believe now at this time made the statement that the revolution would come from the third world. The third world is actually the countryside, and the first world is actually the city. And kind of Congo was kind of a testing ground for that experiment. Unfortunately, things didn't work out. I believe around 1964, 1965, Mulele was murdered by Mobutu. Uh, After the insurgency had went on for like 3 or 4 years and kind of died down. Apparently, he had gotten sick. He had turned himself in for amnesty, and they didn't respect the amnesty, and they murdered him. So yeah, like people say, like Joseph is going to bring up in a newspaper that we had found, I think, published in like the 90s, of some of the writings of Pierre Boulele. He did state that he was about Maoist. A lot of people ask, what exactly is Maoism? Some people think it's this like proclamation of like this new democracy or like the youth come first or something like that. I think Maoism, at least people from the third world can kind of state most frequently is that Maoism is simply Marxism applied to underdeveloped conditions. And that's what you saw like in China. That's what you saw in Vietnam. That's what you saw in Cuba. That's what you saw in Congo, where it was kind of frequently stated that it's not going to be the urban workers revolt or that lead the revolution or that's going to compose the masses of a revolutionary organization. But it's most likely going to be people from a real poor background that don't have access to a lot of modern amenities. But it's not even that they're craving, but it's actually necessary for their lives, like sanitation, potable water, industrialized agriculture, so on and so forth.
I have a question. Could you, I'm curious what you mentioned about Mulele having a different theory of social change. Uh, do you, is that like principally like dialectical materialism, or how would he have, I guess, formulated that differently? And did that also include like particularity to Congolese conditions on the ground? Like I know that in some of the readings there was a lot of discussion about Mulele's engagement with Kimbanguism and other sort of like endogenous philosophies. So I wonder how he kind of took dialectical materialism and incorporated the unique conditions in the Congo.
I would say the extent that he took dialectical materialism and incorporated into the Congo was he actually tried to use that to fight against superstitions and kind of like not like witchcraft. Yeah, the best way I can describe it is like witchcraft that Congolese believe. Um, Sorry, I'm just gathering my thoughts really quick. Yeah, like the Congolese we attributed things a lot to superstition, a lot of things to religion, and he very much emphasizes that like the material in life is actually going to be what's most important and what's going to allow us to liberate us. In terms of his theory of social change and how it differed, you had several theories at this point. So you had Patrice Lumumba that basically thought that we have to show the Europeans, we have to show the outside world that the Congolese are educated people, that we can form an educated class of people that can prove to the world that we're capable of our own governance. Very obviously, it was never about education. Europeans never said you guys can't rule yourselves because you guys aren't educated. You guys can't rule yourselves because you want your resources. That's very much it. You'll very much see that. It's a common trope that you'll see among circles now that talk about the Congo is that they don't have good governance. They don't have people that are capable administrators that can educate. They need European functionaries to do it on their behalf. They need the UN to do it on their behalf, or they just need to break up the state in general. Another theory of social change was that of Che Guevara. He went to the Congo. Conditions were kind of particular at this point because Che Guevara, he had the correct notion that social change would come from the third world. But I think when he arrived in the Congo, he thought kind of like in Cuba, a kind of educated upper middle class vanguard can be like just like 30 people and they can take over the state. Um, Conditions in Cuba and Congo are a little bit different. Congo's massive. It's about the size of Western Europe. It's about the size of half of the United States. So that wasn't really possible. The idea of forming uh, like this mass political party or like this mass army, this people's army, and engaging in a protracted war you saw in Vietnam, it took from like 1945 to 1975 in order to free Vietnam. That's about 30 years. Che Guevara was in the Congo for about 1 year, and he had given up. So that's kind of how he differed from Pierre Mulele, and Pierre Mulele had the Maoist notion that no, it's going to take a protracted people's war in order to liberate the Congo. You have to go to rural areas. You have to start building your state little by little, encircle the cities, and then finally take over.
I have another question. Do you know much if he? Okay, one I gotta say these are all like unique questions off like a little bit of information, but do you know how much like what was his idea for the I guess like what I would refer to as like the peasantry, like the rural areas of the Congo? Did he do something similar to Mao, where it would be like peasant unions or like peasant militant groups, or like what was more the function? Because I know Joseph, you said partisan, so was it more in the line of like Foucault theory of like okay, we need to like militarize people as quickly as possible, or is it more like the power of people like producing it?
Yeah. So as I said, events in the Congo happened extremely quickly. So he never really got. He basically believed in self-organization. They need to organize amongst themselves, but it never really achieved the point where it's like we need to organize ourselves to achieve higher production, or we need to organize ourselves to. Well, they did have youth self-defense groups. That was pretty much the extent of their organization. But like I said, his rebellion only lasted maybe 2 to 3 to 4 years, and it was extremely under-resourced. So unfortunately, they never actually got to that point. One thing I will say is that with, I think, studying what's going on in third world nations, and I would consider at what was at one point a third world nation, China, China, uh, Vietnam, but a big one I think that has strong relations with the Congo is Haiti. Is that you currently see the strong emphasis on endogenous development in Haiti. Have you guys like seen like the canal project that's currently going on in Haiti, where they're trying to build canals to divert water for their agriculture?
Yeah, is that isn't with the DR as well, or there's like
Yeah,
controversy with
so the DR is claiming that the river kind of like belongs to them, or that they're diverting water, and that would affect the amount of water that the Dominican Republic receives. Haiti has stated multiple times that no, this isn't true. That the water is in Haitian territory, and that the reason why the Dominican Republic is against this is because this is going to help Dominican. This is going to help Haitian agriculture, which is going to make it less reliant on Dominican agriculture, and not only that, but we won't need it. Haitians won't have to go to Dominican Republic for work, which the Dominican Republic is strongly against. I would say this can be like very similar to seen as in the Congo, where probably it's the most important thing I think is that even Pierre Mulele emphasizes in endogenous development was that without kind of the development of our own state, of our own infrastructure, they'll always be reliant on going to the West, to earn wages and then send money back for remittances. So yeah.
I'm a little curious about Mulele's relationship because it's sometimes confusing to I think have both Mulele's rebellion and the Simba rebellion um in the east with Gaston Sommelier and a little bit Laurent Kabila, although that's like limited. But I'm especially curious about the I know we've talked a bit before about this like commune that was set up in I think it was in Fizi Baraka or
Oh,
in yeah,
he set up. He declared a Soviet.
that's right. Yeah. I'm curious, like was that Kabila or Mulele who did that?
No, that was Mulele.
Hmm.
Forgot what the province called again. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. I know we talked about this in the podcast.
Yeah, right as the call was starting, I started to read a little bit just like the Wikipedia page too. Um which isn't very long, or I mean, I don't know how accurate, but um I thought it was interesting to read about how his movement got a lot more support from uh like the Chinese, and that I don't know. The Wikipedia kind of suggests that's a reason, part of the reason he turned to Maoism. Of course, that's not the case, but um,
He was a convinced. Before he
yeah,
went to China, he wouldn't have called it Maoism. But once he arrived in China, it was clarified for him that what he believed in was Maoism.
yeah,
Like he actually got born like 1958. There was a big political conference, 1958 or 1959. There was a big political conference in Brussels, uh, basically trying to decide the future of the Congo. The colonizers wanted to find a solution that kind of pleased them as well. This is when Patrice Lumumba and Pierre Mulele, I think this is where Pierre Mulele first came into contact with Marxism. This is where Patrice Lumumba, he was actually first introduced to some Soviet agents that wanted to see, what was his perspective for the Congo, what was his blah blah blah. So probably since late 1950s, they he was a convinced Marxist, but he thought this whole thing with workers isn't going to work in Congo because like till this day, 90% of the Congolese they're not what you would call traditional wage labor. They're what like involved in like peasant agriculture, and even to an extent, you might not even say they're involved in peasant agriculture because so many of them are locked up in UN. But yeah, about the Soviet, he was in the region of Kwilu, so he declared a Soviet in Kwilu, which basically means he's declared like an independent state that he would hope to grow to encompass the entire Congolese state. And like they had their own administration, they had their own military, they had their own police, they had their own jails. Like, these were like primitive things. Like basically the jails were like like a wooden cage cell and stuff like that. But that's basically how he saw a revolution unfolding in the Congo. Was declared like the Soviets around the Congo, where people would basically take power into their own hands, start running their own state. Eventually, they would all link up and form the Congolese state.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I guess, like what the result of that Soviet was and like the commune in Kwilu because I was there I know they tried another one with Kabila in the Fizi region, but that one wasn't as successful. So yeah, I know you mentioned that the Kwilu rebellion didn't last as long, but I wonder like in the areas that they liberated, what life was like. Because I've seen these really interesting pictures. I'll try to find it, but there's one where it's like a crowd marching with a Mao poster. So it seems
Yeah,
like liberated the area.
yeah. Um, in terms of what life was like, I mean, it's, like they said, it was a very, it had very rudimentary technology. So it's just like, we just don't have horrible Belgian or American oppressors. The rebellion was, was dealt massive blow. I think like around 100,000 people were murdered. They had landed Belgian. Cuban and American mercenaries just to mass slaughter people. It significantly weakened it, but it didn't defeat it, by the way. This is when, at one point, he got sick and he fled to Republic of Congo, which is right next to DRC. So that's Congo Brazzaville. In Congo Brazzaville, he was very sick. He accepted amnesty, and then Mobutu murdered him. That was kind of the end of it. In terms of the Fizi Soviet, I actually have never actually heard of that. So I'll actually have to look into that, but I've never heard of the Fizi Soviet because there was a lot of movements at the time that were going on, and Pierre Mulele is like the only one that you can really say was a true leftist, true Marxist movement. But a lot of them, to get public sympathy, they claim to be leftist and Marxist as well when they weren't at all.
I have like one last question, and then I don't know if others have more, but we can also look at the commandments to his partisans. But my last question is, I once was talking with someone from the Congolese diaspora, and he described Mulele. He called him a fanatic, which I thought was pretty
Yeah,
interesting. I'm curious if you can talk about like how after he was killed, Mobutu and the like Zairian regime kind of continually demonized him and made him into because they kind of rehabilitated Lumumba to my knowledge, but they never made Mulele like a acceptable.
so I think Lumumba it's actually interesting that you said they rehabilitated him because initially Mobutu had called him a terrorist, but obviously Lumumba was so popular across the world that you couldn't really do anything to smear his reputation. So initially he was called, but then to kind of co-opt him, they kind of co-opted Lumumba's name, and they basically said that this next government under Mobutu was a continuation of Lumumba's ideology. It's a black government. They got rid of the Belgians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, Mulele during this time, this is what they call the Congo crisis. That kind of like the conflict in Gaza or the U.S. entanglement in Vietnam. It's just like this random problem somewhere across the world that they don't really know what's happening. But obviously, and this is the way they portrayed it to the Congolese people. You had all these rebellions that are going across the Congo, and many people just chancing the fact that their leaders that they actually liked, Lumumba, had been murdered. So you have all these rebellions that are they're trying to claim true independence, and lots of people are suffering and dying because of it. Because of this, Mobutu tried to put the blame on Mulele that this suffering is all because of him. And if he just stopped this rebellion, everybody would go live peacefully again. And this was also another big propaganda tactic of Mobutu. Once they finally, once the rebellions were finally quashed, they said that Mobutu was the great unifier. There was the Katongan secession. He kind of encompassed the Katongan secession that the Belgians, the people that backed him, created. He encompassed that with Mulele Soviet and the Simba rebellion in eastern Congo, saying that they were all one, and that him, Mobutu, he quashed these things, and he was the great unifier. He unified the country. So Pierre Mulele is along the same lines with the Soviets, so that's why they call him like a terrorist. If you ever meet like Congolese people, particularly like in the American diaspora, like the older generation that grew up under Mobutu, they said that they were taught that Pierre Mulele was a terrorist.
Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions?
I don't have another question, but I was wondering if we can, or well, actually, like, is one of these pictures in the chat, is that the art that people were talking about? Because I kind of want to see.
No, I'll send the art right now. But it's of the like Simba rebellion. I don't know. Can everybody see that? I just sent it. Just let me know if you can.
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I
The
mean,
thing I sent is just a screenshot from the Wikipedia page. It's the section that's about how there was like a the American government like airlifted like 2,000 um like settler hostages from um like during the rebellion, and then it also talks about like the involvement of Belgian troops. I just thought that was important to look at. But sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No,
Joseph.
no, that's exactly what the art that I sent depicts.
Oh,
I only
okay.
recently found this artwork, and I don't know. I was trying to look for accreditation for it, but I couldn't really find anything. It is with the like Smithsonian Museum, I think. And it doesn't really say much about who made it, but it depicts like you can see the paratroopers arriving. They're American cargo planes, and it's specifically the airlift on Stanleyville which occurred. There were a few, and I mean, Carmel, just correct me if I'm wrong about anything, but I know that there was one um also when Gazenga was still in power, because there's, I guess, multiple different overlapping times. Like Gazenga, right after Lumumba was killed, had established a Soviet and like Egyptian backed government based out of Stanleyville. And Stanleyville historically was like Lumumba's base of power, I think. And so they did an airlift then, but I don't know if the Americans were involved at that time. That's something that Che, in his like UN address, he talks a lot about the Congo, and he decries like American intervention. But anyways, this painting just depicts that scene, and it kind of shows, I think, like the Simba rebels were armed mainly with bows and arrows, although they probably also had some modern technology, kind of like what Kirma was saying. They were under resourced compared to a total massacre of American aircraft or American carrier planes with Belgian paratroopers, South African paratroopers, and then there were also like anti-Castro Cuban mercenaries and fighter jet pilots who bombed in the east and against Mulele's rebellion, which is something that like Malcolm X and others in particular were decrying at the time. So I think this painting does a good job of kind of depicting the slaughter that the Western forces perpetuated that killed like 100,000 people. I know it's something we've talked a little bit about before, but it's kind of curious to see how there's a great interview with Malcolm X where he's asked about the attacks against white hostages in the Congo, and he says like, well, why didn't anybody care when the Belgians were massacring people? They only care now when like missionaries are being taken hostage or whatever. It's very similar to Gaza, I guess, like how the rhetoric of like Israeli hostages being taken, and then they're both pointing out the legitimacy of the armed anti-colonial resistance. So yeah.
I'm definitely gonna do like a Google image search for this image for this painting because I would love to know like if it was like a Congolese person who painted it or if they were like actually there. Because it's a very interesting, like I don't know, just
Yeah,
interesting piece of it.
I tried to do a Google image reverse search as well. Unfortunately, I didn't find much, but I did find out that the Smithsonian has it. So I emailed them already actually. I'm gonna like try and follow up and see if they know who the author is. They said they gave the name as Wende F, but they didn't give the last name. I'm sure they have it in their like collection records or whatever. So I'll look more into it, and I'll definitely follow up with everybody like what I find about who made it. There's also some website that says that there's like a slightly different version of the painting that I saw, and that website says that the person who owns it got it from a Portuguese merchant in the Congo. Um, but I don't know. It doesn't really give more details about who painted it itself. So, but yeah, it's a great point. Like I when I look at it, it's kind of a good example of maybe one of the few like recollections of the time period about what the massacre looked like from the paratroopers, because I don't know how many pictures or videos exist of that like the paratroopers in the West massacring people, but this is like a good documentation of that.
So
I
do
don't
we want to talk about, sorry that I interrupt,
know. I was also gonna, were you gonna segue?
the
Yeah.
letter?
Yeah, we can talk about the letter that he wrote on the party. I'm also gonna send the because we were talking a bit about his connection to Maoism. I'm gonna send there's a good I really like this like side by side comparison of Mulele's commandments to his partisans and Mao's 8 recommendations to which are quite similar. I think the it shows that they're similar, a little bit different. And
Oh
I guess
yeah,
like there's some particularities maybe to the Congolese situation that Mulele was adapting. But otherwise they're quite similar recommendations. And I guess we could talk more about like why Mao had these recommendations in his context and how Mulele also kind of like adapted them to the Congolese situation. But I'm curious what people's thoughts are before I give like my own take, I guess.
So could you state that question again, please?
Yeah, I guess my question is I guess how Mulele adapted Mao's commandments to his soldiers to the Congolese condition because I guess wasn't just a direct importation of Mao's recommendations, even though they're quite similar. And what was unique about the Congolese situation, even though they both are like, I guess, in the third world, that Mulele would have had to adapt to. But then also, like, I guess, compare and contrast the two, like what's similar, what's different.
I mean, the first thing I can think of is that like Mao's recommendations are like 8 points of attention, or like how I learned about it. Um, like that was for the Red Army, which I mean I don't know much about Mulele and like partisans, but there was a difference between the Red Army and the Communist Party, especially like uh, how Mao kind of orchestrated his forces within the Red Army. So I think that definitely for someone who's carrying out a rebellion or protracted people's war, uh, this stuff like makes a lot of sense because it's something that you'll see in the everyday.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious about comparing like the class character of the two armies. So something I've read a little bit about is that Mao had to kind of deal with class contradictions within the Red Army, like the petty bourgeois officers versus some soldiers that came from like the lumpen class, for example. So some of these rules are maybe like universally applicable no matter the class character of the soldier, but some of them are also like specific to different maybe to like different contexts. Like there's a lot of emphasis on not stealing things, which I find interesting because you could think like with what Karamo was mentioning, if an under-resourced army had captured prisoners, why not take their commodities like their rings and watches and stuff? But I guess part of the objective, to my understanding, was to gain the sympathy of the people and not to come off as like a bandit army, which was the case for the militaire. By contrast, as that one paper that Kalema wrote, which I don't know if I sent to everybody. I sent it in the Friends of the Congo group chat, but that one paper talks about how the military, even that paper talks about how both armies had very different approaches to like capturing prisoners, to having to execute enemies, for example. The Mulele's partisans respected the rights of people more, even the enemies that they were fighting against. So I wonder, like, what in both of these is like the theory of behind like respect and loyalty within the army, within like the Red Army or Mulele's partisans, for example, and how is it trying to bring together, I guess, multiple different classes of struggle? Because, like Caramel mentioned, if the majority of the army probably is coming from the peasantry, there isn't as much an urban proletariat or even an industrial proletariat to form the base of the army. How do you make still like a proletarian army in in nature, even if it isn't primarily composed of the proletariat itself, is I guess like an overarching question.
So
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
What I would no, actually, I want you to go ahead. I want to hear what you guys have to say.
Thanks. So yeah, real quick, I just wanted to just go in as far as um the idea of revolution is more than just uh time and space, right? It is a movement that has to transcend time and space. So when we're the reason I could see you having to deal with respect is because you're coming from a higher plane. We're not fighting necessarily for our generation, but we're fighting for the generations to come. So when people are able to look back and understand why this movement did what it did, it may bring light to the thinking of those that come after. So as long as you continue in that conscious level of thinking, um, then whether you lose the battle, it'll allow you to eventually win the war and win the minds of those, whether it happens 100 years down the line or even further. It allows for that understanding to come through and to grow. So that's what I can say as far as how that links and continues in these struggles. But it is funny that when you look up, say, the Maoist revolution or Mulele's revolution, of course, there's always negative connotation on their ideals and what they were doing. But when in fact they probably held more respect for the children of those fighting than they did themselves. That's just my thoughts on that. Quick.
That's really great. Yeah, that's a great analysis.
Yeah, what I would just wanted to add to what Joseph was saying earlier about like the lumpen character of the army. Um, Joseph, we read a book earlier, like not this year, but maybe last year. George Talaja's and Zangola's History of the Congo, and one thing he mentions is like the class elements during the independence movement of the Congo. And one element he talked about was almost like this kind of lumpenized sector of Congolese workers, with basically people that come from rural areas going to the cities looking for wage labor. They aren't able to get wage labor because there's not enough. This is such a problem within the Congo that the Belgians instituted the system of basically passports to cross provinces or to come into a city. You need to have a passport. So you basically have rural workers that come into the city that don't have these passports that then can't get legal work, so they have to work under the table. And yeah, they're part of that sector, and they're kind of in between the cities and the rural areas. Things aren't working out in the cities; they go back to the rural areas. This is kind of what uh, at least in Mulele's case, was kind of like the lumpinized workers, whereas in like China, it was like they just had like general bandits, like roaming bandits that were roaming the countryside that didn't have a lot of state, where there wasn't a state very present, so these people just like prey on innocent people uh, without very much repercussion. And I think like these people were like characterized as kind of needing a little bit more discipline or a little needing to be watched over a little bit because they're kind of a significant sector of you know the of the Revolutionary Army. At the same time, they still have a mentality where it's like you have to prey upon others for or exploit others for your own benefit because of their living conditions, how they grew up, and so on and so forth. So you have to be a little bit more harder on them, not just like outright reject them. I'm curious, like probably within the context of the Black Panther Party, where they had looked at the prison population in the United States being a significant potential of revolutionary action. But still, for them to have like, I wouldn't say that criminal mentality, but to be raised in the United States the way that they were, for them to see, hey, we have to prey upon one another in order to get, our daily bread. How could, the lessons that Mulele and now the rules that they apply to their army, how could that be applied in like the United States or even like maybe like Nation of Islam and like Black Islamic thought can be kind of seen as that like intense discipline that Malcolm X talks about.
One thing I wanted to add before we get into what I think is a great discussion talking about like more of a US context. Um, I feel like it's important to note when it comes to the China, when on the side of China and Mao, that, most of the army, like kind of drawing out more of what Joseph was saying about the class character of the army. A lot of the people who had joined, like the most militant forces, were kind of these like disenfranchised peasantry who, their families had very small plots of land and would often get like kind of consumed by larger peasants. And so, when you have no land or your land gets, bought out by someone else, and you quickly run out of the money that you were given for that, um, they would kind of form these bandit groups. But most of these bandit groups were very specifically related to like one city or another. So, like, oftentimes they would be in the highlands, and the more fertile territory would be in the lowlands. And so they would like kind of come down from the mountains and uh, do different bandit stuff. They would kidnap people. They would steal. And so like one problem they had in China was that, as the Red Army would move from town to town, they would quickly lose people, because they were like, okay, we liberated this area. Now I want to go back and farm the land that, I had originally farmed or that I thought that I should farm. Um, and I think that was like a big part of it, that there was this kind of like personal vendetta against these people. Um, and there wasn't a lot of discipline in the army because like Mao had to do a lot of um, kind of these like agreements with heads of families. He would meet with, like a head of a family, and he would try and convince them, and then they would convince, their younger brothers, their cousins, things like that. And I think like that is like one of the reasons why you have that like emphasis on like stealing and like how you see people.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for that context. I really like Maoism. It's like there's so much pragmatism behind it that a lot of people, I don't know, they either look through and they just think like, oh, this guy's an opportunist, this guy was just a nationalist, or it always like blows by people in the West, like it blows by over their heads. Thank you for that context.
I was going to add that, when it comes to classism, especially, in the United States, when you talk about, coming from a prison population, um, we look at Jim Crow era and what um, being in prison as a Black American um, could be something as simple as wrong place, wrong time, right? So to and we all get caught up in defining people because of being in prison and not just realizing that they are just, for the most part, is individuals that have been left behind by the state, a lot of times, and especially when we have a political system like we do here, um, and that benefits off of that, right? So it's one of the things to also to continue to keep in mind is that yeah, a lot of those that joined those groups were ex-prisoners, ex-convicts, but what did it mean to be an ex-convict really? Like, it was, it's just something to put in the thought as well.
Yeah, and also to like contrasting the violence of like colonial and these like these kind of like the prison systems, whether that's in the Congo or in the United States, are like serve basically, yeah, like you were talking about, the purpose of kind of like disabling the population and kind of just throwing out violence in a way just for the sake of terror, but and this is why they don't really care about their prisoners. And but like in the command, in one of the things, there's something about taking prisoners, um, and with a lot of revolutionary groups, they have a idea of what they want to get out of even having prisoners. Like they don't actually want to have prisoners like for the rest of time. They want to be able to turn these people around, and also to, and you can see this with stuff with whenever you look at like the prison conditions of um during like the Red Army, and then compare you just whenever you compare the revolutionary prisons to the like really built up systematic prisons, and generally just places of torture and violence, um, they serve completely different purposes.
That's very true. That's very true. I remember, I, I had years in the military years ago, and one of the things we studied was the the prison system for prisons of war during World War One, as opposed to prisons of war and basically every war after that. And it was like you said, it was a matter of just holding someone and keeping them on your line for so they're not a part of the other unit, as opposed to the torturing and the barbaric stuff that goes on today. So yeah.
That's really interesting. I just resent the thesis that I referenced earlier, which is about torture and bodily harm in general during the period of the rebellion. And the author, I haven't read the whole thing. I would like to go more into it, but the author makes argument that Mulele's rebels were more focused on sort of redeeming the body. Whether people want to interpret that in like a spiritual way or a materialist way of like redeeming the body politic of the Congo as a whole, with what Caramel mentioned, the second independence, and kind of cleansing the body of the last parasitic elements of colonialism. But that even when, because they would practice torture, like any army wasn't just everybody was abiding by all of these principles completely. But the author even argues that like they're when they would hold prisoners, or they would apply techniques to gain information, it wasn't to destroy the body of the person, because they saw what was happening, that it was a war of Congolese soldiers fighting other Congolese soldiers. I mean, there were these paratroopers and mercenaries and stuff, but for the most part, it was a lot of people in I guess what would have been after that, the ANC, which was still like the remnants of the Force Publique. So they weren't like most were like were fighting, let's say like fighting our brothers or something like that. So they didn't want to kill or destroy fellow Congolese people, but they saw it as like people kind of in thrall to neocolonialism, that they had to break that hold over them without trying to kill their body. I mean, I'm like paraphrasing this thesis, which I haven't fully read, but I really like a lot of aspects of it. Like they still believe in the ability to reclaim the body of the enemy who's fighting for the for Mobutu or for the neo-colonial regime. They almost see them as like possessed, even though that is kind of a, I guess, like a more spiritual or metaphysical proposition, that there's some uh kind of like possession or hauntedness or whatever, that they saw it that way. Like there's something, their mind is colonized in some way to serve the army with the material benefits that come from that. And I'm curious how that relates to what you mentioned earlier, Kito, about like this rebellion's objective was to try and change society generations down, and that even if that meant they couldn't win by just doing what the enemy did, which was like exterminating the rebels completely with bombing cities and just massacres, they didn't believe in that. They did believe in a deep cleansing of the society from the source of colonialism, which was still the problem. So yeah, I'm just curious. Like, I'm curious to read that thesis more and find out more about how Mulele's rebels perceive that. And then even there's a section which looks really interesting about how they refuse to believe that Mulele could have died when Mobutu captured him when he returned from exile. And a lot of people would report later on that he was still like walking amongst them and he was still giving orders even though the rebellion had died. And I mean, maybe too, like and I agree with what Caramel said earlier about trying to get rid of more spiritualisms within the revolution, but also that stuff still being part of like this future oriented goal to defeat colonialism as this force on the body of the Congo as a whole and on the body of Africa more broadly. So yeah, I'm curious to read that more, and maybe we can like discuss that thesis more.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to point that you brought up, Joseph, about almost like people being possessed by something, and kind of like the revolutionary movement trying to drag that person, awaken them from that evil. Because I see this like same trope. Um, two places I saw the same trope is one reference to Nazi Germany, that the German people were possessed by Hitler, that Hitler had casted a spell on the German people, and that as soon as he died, like that kind of like that spell was lifted. And I saw that also that reference also several times during the Vietnam War, and that the American people don't know what they had just experienced. They have to like kind of process what they had just experienced. They have to awaken from what had just gone on, which was essentially a state genocide against people. Uh, I would bring up is that kind of that spiritualism of, it's upon the not it's upon the colonized, but you taking the labor of having to, you know, cleanse this person of this evil, to, awaken them, and not, this person's kind of intentionally doing this. They're very much aware of what they're doing, and they're very much aware of the harm it's causing. They just don't care. And in some facts, they take great pleasure in it. That's something that, that's kind of like I wrestle with. Like you say, obviously, if a vaunted leader like Guillermo Lele believes in, having to bring people out of their slumber, but at the same time, sometimes I feel like be excused by the colonizer to say, that they had misunderstood something, that there was some sort of thing external to them that caused them to do this, and that it shouldn't be representative of who they are. And sometimes I might argue that that's not actually the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that's interesting to relate to a broader understanding of why Mao or Mulele would have insisted that the revolution originate in the decolonizing countries was not didn't have so much to do with the relations of production in a on a local level, because obviously the proletariat as a whole uh is more in the advanced countries. But they were insisting because they saw that the even the proletariat of those countries had this parasitic dimension with the masses of the third world. And I guess like one thing that is really interesting to me with that instruction about not to take rings and watches and stuff from the enemy, it's even like whether that's mercenaries or soldiers of the Armée Nationale Congolais, the Mobutu's army, the militaries, I guess, to not like reify the material relations of capitalism and not insist like, oh, it's actually a good thing to loot from the enemy, because that's equivalent to what the opposing army thought was correct to do, was to like take these commodities and become almost like warlords, I guess, to some degree. So that insistence on don't allow capitalism to possess or indoctrinate the people was, I guess, related to the fact that that was like a relatively new ideology from just 100 years of or less of colonialism, and it was still something that could actively be resisted. Like those commodity relations could still be fought, and this was one way of fighting them, is say you don't actually need that ring or that watch, and it's not helping the revolution for soldiers to steal in that way, even though expropriation as a whole was occurring. So that's kind of interesting, like insisting on kind of upending the material relations while also not allowing the superstructure of capitalism to, or like commodity relations to take hold amongst the revolutionary masses. Because I think that maybe isn't like that's harder to talk about today because capitalism has become more developed in the third world, but it's still more or less true that there isn't as much of like a pure commodity fetishism, I suppose, in the way that there is in the like consumer oriented societies in the global north.
For sure, for sure. I think it's you look at the communities now, even here in the United States, it's like what are we fighting for? Um, are we fighting just to replace the same system with more of the same? And that's the one thing you have to make sure you steer away from. So having these points in place, allows you to not go down that road, right? Because I like to say, when we look at some of the those in our history, it's like, we're just replacing masters. We're not trying to replace masters. We're making sure that everyone gets to a position where they're at masters of their own selves. We're not looking to start a revolution so we can be in charge. We're looking to start a revolution for change. So, it allows them not to go down that slippery slope.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And even more broadly, fighting against yeah, it's interesting to think of, I guess, like the role of the bourgeoisie in this context of like there it's hard to even talk of one, I guess, but it is like that nascent lumpen bourgeoisie like Mobutu and his allies, and that is just a pure kleptocracy of just taking, and there's pure corruption, um and that is something that, like you said, that these commandments are written even for now. If there is this like ongoing struggle, that you can still apply these same commandments because they kind of transcend time. Like the rule is to resist this commodity fetishism that is the basis of capitalism and capitalistic relations. Um, and that Mulele saw that very clearly, I think is really fascinating. And I would say, I mean, this might be, I'm not sure, I haven't like fully thought about it, but I would say maybe even a little bit more so than Mao, because you see that the points are a little bit different, with this like specific emphasis on um and not just on like commodity fetishism, but even also on the role of women in the struggle. Both of the commandments explicitly say that women are not to be treated as commodities as well. But it seems like Mulele's also really emphasizes that the the revolutionary masses shouldn't seize these things. Like expropriation will occur, but expropriation doesn't just mean taking things and acquire, and like you said, exactly like you said, becoming a new master or just becoming a new bourgeoisie. That the end goal is not just to take wealth just to have it. It's to abolish property relations and to expropriate the expropriators, etc. So yeah, I think Mulele's points I think also tie in that the Congo is maybe even more so new to like colonial capitalistic relations than even maybe Mao's that was experiencing. And so maybe that's where there is more of a revolutionary impetus. Maybe today that's true, and maybe in that time it was occurring right after the Chinese Revolution had occurred. But I think it's just interesting to see that Mulele had more of an insistence on preserving what was before colonialism had come in, and I mean using that as the basis to decolonize the society. I think is interesting. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, go ahead.
hearing like about these, you guys were calling them Soviets earlier, which sound like they're kind of like like communal bases of living to try to like keep the um revolution or like the movement going in mutual aid is really interesting, just because I love learning about the kind of like uh especially with sort of like what's going on in other parts of the world, like in uh yeah, 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 and it in a way the communal structure is like a method of decolonization, because you remove these needs for um like uh like for so many like commodities, and um also it kind of can eliminate the contradictions between the um pre-colonial and the like current way of life. I would assume for um the native people, but I think it's just interesting, and also an important part of like building a support structure to not just continue relying on the same systems.
Just for my context, I think when Pierre Mulele, some of his writings when he talked about declaring a Soviet, I think he was more so talking about a state with kind of like a leftist slash workers character, and not necessarily kind of like this state with like mutual aid and a lot of that stuff going on, because there is kind of like a reoccurring theme that you'll see in Congolese literature, whether that's in the West or whether that's in Congo, is the development of a state. That people often say that the Congolese is a state without a state. They don't really have a functioning military, don't have a functioning administration. So kind of the development of that is often seen as primary importance, and I think that could be a little bit controversial because that comes off as authoritarian in the West.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that, and also sorry to just jump in, and I also want to give others a chance to say. I just did immediately that came to my mind the question that we've been referencing throughout of how to make a dictatorship of the proletariat and this different type of state when the majority of the country is not proletarian in class. And maybe that's changed a little bit today, but that's kind of what they were experimenting with, I think, like how to have a proletarian state without having the proletariat have been fully, because even I guess in these contexts the proletariat is not, it is like comes off as kind of a European imposition to some degree, even if it is the, like most, like Mulele would have recognized the proletariat as the most advanced class in struggle in line with Marx, but he also would have seen it as like a thing Europeans had introduced, like wage labor, like you were mentioning earlier, Caramel. So how to, I guess, reconcile that it isn't a class that is endogenous to the Congo or to the third world in general, but nevertheless it becomes the revolutionary class in the era of capitalism. So I think that's curious to see how proletarian uh, characteristics or specialities were introduced in the nature of the state that may not have really aligned with exactly what the people experienced as their class at the time. Like if most people were peasants, or there was a lot of like you were mentioning, these kind of transitional workers or workers who had to move from a rural area to the city, but were sort of like transient workers to some degree, how to make the kind of like proletarian characteristics for the state composed of those people. And I think that's where a lot of the need for the revolution being led, and this is, I guess, different from, like you said, the Foucault theory, in that it is trying to bring the mass along. Maybe it is closer to like a mass line style politics, but it is trying to bring the mass in line faster with proletarian characteristics without forcing it, especially not from a sort of petty bourgeois top down vanguard approach as much, but how to do that that is in line with the what people would have been more familiar with, which wouldn't be the proletariat as much, or an urban existence, would have been more familiar with a rural communal existence. So yeah, how to, I guess, balance that. And these are not, I don't know that we have, even maybe 60 years on from this rebellion, this was the best attempt to really do a lot of these things, and that it was so short and short-lived, and it was suppressed so quickly. But I think it's a really good example of these commandments in particular. Like, these could be rules for an army, they could be rules for a governing body of like a workers and soldiers council, like in the Soviet Revolution, but they overall end up being really close to what the society would like to practice to some degree as a whole. And it's funny that that has a lot to do with how to conduct yourself in a state of siege or a constant state of warfare at the same time. But I'm curious to hear other people's interpretation. That's just my perspective, I guess.
No, I think it's spot on, man. It's like you said, the enemy is the capitalistic mindset, right? The enemy is not the people, because the people are just being moved and herded into positions, and they feel as though that's the right way. But through the right education, the right understanding, and if you go spiritually, you understand that um, it's a spiritual battle that we have to fight, right? So that mindset doesn't coexist with those spiritual guidance that we learn uh, centuries centuries and centuries of learning, whether it be put in different religious forms, or however we gain our spiritual knowledge, our spiritual information. We understand that what's right is right, and so a lot of times when you think of how that capitalistic system and that capitalistic mindset is more of the enemy than the people, and that's where it also is able to sustain those that come after. Everybody doesn't have to get infected by that.
I wanted to add, I feel this is very controversial, so I've kind of been quiet about it, but I do feel that the kind of de-emphasis of class in this in the sense that like okay they wanted to establish like what Caramel said oh the Soviet was actually more like a state than it was like a commune or like a liberated zone. Um, I feel like that actually is somewhat of a failure of Mulele, because like there has to be a very strong understanding of like class forces and the like makeup of the economic conditions in the country in order to have a very like long lasting revolution. Um, and I think that was something that like Mao did very well was that he was able to retreat. That there was like more maneuvering ability because he was able to really dig deep into the class character of China, of semi-colonial, semi-feudal China, understanding that very deeply. And of course, I haven't read Mulele, you know, really at all, and I'm just learning about it from this conversation. But I do think that, you know, I know from like other examples in other countries where, there is like a big post-colonial struggle, like a struggle for liberation. There's often like this weird mixing of classes, which sometimes undermines the revolution itself because, you know, without really getting to the heart of okay, why is Congo being dominated by Western imperialist forces? Well, it's because of because of the condition of capitalist imperialism. They are extracting surplus value from the workers of Congo, right? It's not just that Congo is rich in natural resources. Those natural resources have to be extracted by human beings putting in labor. So there has to be an emphasis on that work because that's the emphasis by the capitalists for why Congo is important as well. And so without utilizing that power and that force against, uh, you know, the conquistador class, then you're also going to be left in the hinterland without much support from the broader mass. It's quite a controversial take, but that's how I see it.
Not to I guess put you on the spot if you don't have thoughts about it. Well, one, I'm really curious what you think about that, Caramel. Because I think we have in the past talked a bit about okay, like why did Shea's approach fail in the East? And then I guess yeah, we haven't analyzed as much why did, and I wouldn't say, I mean, I really like your perspective, Keto, about, I mean, you can't say this failed. Like if you think that in the long run this is a the beginning of a struggle, and then Mulele's ideas are in the long in the final analysis going to be successful in the Congo, but in the first iteration, I suppose it didn't work immediately at that time, which could be seen as the same way I think Mao's forces or the Chinese long-term revolution wasn't successful immediately and had to develop over time. Which is to say, if there is a growing proletariat in the Congo, maybe still not a mass or still not the majority, but that those proletarian ideas can be more immediately available to lead the revolutionary struggle. But anyways, I'm curious what you think, Caramel.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and this is kind of why, I was whenever I speak with Joseph about this, I'm just like, we just don't really know the extent of the exploitation in the Congo, just because we get so little information coming out of the country, and the little that we do is often filtered through a Western lens. Um, so with regards to like, just to clarify, you basically said that like anybody that to extract those resources need people to do that work, and the people that do those work should they automatically be classified as laborers, or like workers? Am I correct in saying that?
You're asking me if I think that those people are laborers?
Yes.
Um, I mean, of course, there are different things. Like, okay, some of it is peasantry, like you own small plots of land, work it, and produce, crops. But I'm sure, in that time there were like huge expansions of mining operations, and mine workers are 100% proletarian. Um, whether they uh I do think that it gets into a gray area when we start talking about people who are like forced to work. But I'm sure there was
Yeah,
still people who were paid, and were proletarian in nature. I'm not exactly sure, like I wouldn't be able to give you a proper analysis of the distinction, but I still think that those people are the working class of the country, even if they are enslaved or not.
yeah, that's like you kind of caught on to my point right there. But a lot of this can just be like straight up forced labor at gunpoint. Currently, there's a extremely large UN presence. There's the presence of 3, 4 foreign militaries on the country's territory. A lot of it's just straight up at gunpoint. You're gonna do this or you get killed. You're gonna do this or your children get mutilated. There's a lot of awful images that come out of Congo of some of the things that happens to people that don't comply. So that's like a huge. It's really really good that you bring up this point because that's a huge contentious point that comes up when you're talking about third world revolutions. It's like even if it is the case that these people are forced laborers and they're not wage laborers, if it's the case that they're forced laborers, there's actually a sizable contingent of people that believe because that's the case, they cannot be that they don't have any revolutionary potential. Um, so I guess like what I would like respond to that context is whether they're proletarian or not. I think in either case they still have revolutionary potential and probably far more than most people in this world do, specifically in the first world. Yeah, but I would also say another big thing is you explained about how it's significant that yes, they have a lot of resources that are being exploited, but uh, people need to work those resources. They need to mine those resources. They need to take it. They can just mass murder a whole bunch of these people and bring a foreign population, a foreign militia to come and mine those resources. They can. Another big thing is the underdevelopment of the Congolese economy. Congo's a tropical country with blessed with lands, water, a very very rich agriculture. It says it's often framed that it can be the breadbasket of Africa. You have to keep in mind all that agriculture. It's not competing with the Brazilian beef industry, the Southeast Asian rice economy. The Congolese people are not competing with China's industrial sector, although they possess the majority of the minerals that the Chinese use. So underdeveloping their economy also allows other economies to be more competitive in comparison. So that kind of framing can also be used with what are the motivations for imperialist intervention in Congo. A sovereign currency, as we saw, as we've seen with like France and their domination of the currencies and the French African zone, is that oftentimes, at the moment, Congolese minerals, all of it is denominated in dollars. The Congolese economy is completely dollarized. The same way as in the Middle East, all the oil is denominated in dollars. A sovereign country will immediately change that. So I guess those are all my 2 cents on other angles we can view it, and not just exclusively through the angle of like labor and unequal.
Um, I I want to respond, but let me think about it for a little bit. Because I think that uh maybe my point wasn't as clear. I'm not sure. But I think what you're saying about Congo is true, definitely, right? Like, okay, say they wanted to tell everyone and bring new people in. Say they, it's definitely true that currencies are used to dominate, and that countries compete on like an economic scale. Um, but you know, China, let's take China for example. China was competing with India as colonies. They were both producing cotton. This was like a huge a huge part of agricultural production and then manufacturing in both of those countries. And it was actually a lot of those people either working in the garment industry or people working in uh, the cotton production, who were instrumental in the like May 4th movement in China. Um, so I actually think that, in these colonial contexts, it's even more important to understand the way that class and labor interact, um, because it is like a foreign imposition, right? That these countries expand their industrial production and agricultural production so much because of, foreign invasion. Um, and the truth is, the majority of it is worked by the indigenous population, right? Like in almost every context, most of the workers are indigenous peoples. Um, so while, okay, maybe if Belgium wanted to kill every single person in the Congo, they wouldn't be able to extract as much value out of the resources inside of the country if they did that. And I know that's like a very brutal, like unpersonable view of it, but I do think that's how capitalism sees itself and how it works. That, you know, they use their violent mechanisms of control in order to actually make a subservient population. They would rather have a whole country of servants rather than replace them. And I still think it's true that, when we talk about revolution, we have to talk about the people who make society. Without workers, there is no society. Without workers, there is no Congo because, what was there to extract besides the value of those workers? And by workers, I mean the people, like these are the actual people who, you know, how do they live their everyday lives? What you do for your work is very important. So I would say like that's kind of how I see it. Um, but I do think that there's a more of a middle ground. There is some more gray areas, because we're talking about a colonial context. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
No, I hear what you're saying, bro, and I appreciate you saying that. It's very important to understand and look at that, right? So we have, let's just take the cell phone, right? We don't get cell phones here without the Congo and what's going on in the Congo. And now, say my daughter wants to get a summer job, and the only one that's hired is Apple Store or something, right? So is she, of course, this thing ain't gonna happen in my household, but but for just purposes of understanding what you're saying and putting it into put it into my own words, I guess, be saying will be yes. But yes, for me, I consider all of it that's working class. Here in the United States, although we are all complicit in what's going on over there in the Congo, um, we are still, most of us, part of the working class. Um, and I guess a better term may be the people. So when we talk about the people, that's who we're talking about. And so as a strategy and tactic, for those of us that understand these situations, those of us that are guiding and looking to move the masses, we just have to do that. We have to be able to offer, you know, um, offer an alternative to what is already in place, right? So for example, we're talking about, the cell phone, right? Well, if we can make a way to where the Congolese can produce it, they can manufacture it, and they can sell it there from there, then it changes the whole game, right? Or, if and then of course, what kind of, the currency, of course, is very important because that also goes into it. But I'm doing a lot of talking and rambling, but I guess the main thing I want to say, yes, when you say the people, the working class, yes, sometimes the working class is complicit, but it doesn't make them the enemy. Um, it's just, the contradictions have to start. We just have to start obtaining more knowledge. So when those contradictions start to show themselves, we can make the right decision.
I really agree with that. I think that's an excellent way to put it. And I think using the example of the iPhone and the Congo really helps elucidate the layers of the contradiction. So it takes it out of just maybe like it is one thing to say at kind of like a superficial level that there's just the workers of the world, but then it is clarifying more to see how there's layers to it. And also that, I mean, I think that's how I guess like class can be interpreted in a way that isn't so that is like multifaceted and multi-sided and not so much one dimensional, that it overlaps with a lot of other features like nationality, like even, I mean, I don't know, yeah, even discussing like the question of diaspora and like racial capitalism in the United States is overlying that as well. And what maybe that points to for me, I think, is like increased solidarity between the workers with a global perspective in the first world, who could understand the situation in the Congo as part of a longer history and part of a longer project. But that just requires like, yeah, a lot more education and struggle. But I really like that example, and I think it's cool to hear that you would definitely not let your daughter work at an Apple store from knowing the political and historical side of that. I think that's really cool.
For sure. I've fortunate enough to um, leave some contradictions behind myself. So my thing is that my children and those behind me or come after me will make sure that if there are any more contradictions left, they're working on the other side. And that's what we're doing now. With the work I do, Friends of the Congo is working against what's taking place now. So yeah, nobody be working at Apple.
Cool. Yeah. No, that's great to hear. Um, well, I know it's been a while. I'm really glad we were all able to make it though for this discussion. Um, there's probably a lot more to talk about with Mulele, and we have the thesis as well. I'd love to dig more into that. Like Forrest mentioned, it is kind of difficult to read, and there's a lot in there that maybe is engaging with other like maybe more philosophical stuff and other schools of thought. But I think it could be interesting to read and talk more about. And if not, we can always go more in detail into the history. I'd love to read some of what Malcolm X had to say about that time period and his own solidarity for the liberation struggle. But yeah, we can plan that out for future weeks. And I don't know if anybody has any final thoughts, but I'm I'm glad we were able to discuss today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Joseph. This was a great discussion. I definitely learned something new, and I learned a lot about the Congo that I did not know before. So I appreciate it, you and Caramel, for giving us some great insight.
Thank you, Joseph, for hosting that. Thank you for keeping up the good work.
Yeah, thanks everybody for participating. I definitely got some great stuff that I learned out of this, and also like some good connections. Always nice to learn more about the like how like some more discussions about Maoism earlier were really good. I really yeah, appreciate talking to all you guys. Thanks for spending the time. Have a good night.
Cool.
Same here.
All right.
Appreciate it. Nice talk, and I look forward to many more. So how we had to continue that education. Start to small groups. We'll grow it from there.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your night.
Yeah,
Take care.